Ladies and gentlemen, today we revisit one of the most haunting mysteries in aviation history, the tragedy of South African Airways Flight 295, also known as the Helderberg. On November 28, 1987, South African Airways Flight 295, widely known as the Helderberg, prepared for what was expected to be a routine long-haul journey from Taipei in Taiwan to Johannesburg in South Africa with a scheduled refueling stop in Mauritius. And on board were 159 individuals, consisting of passengers and crew, people from different walks of life, business travelers, families, students, and dedicated airline staff. All brought together on a Boeing 747 Combi aircraft, a special design that allowed both passengers and cargo to share space within the same deck. A layout that was efficient yet carried its own risks, and as the aircraft taxied and lifted off the runway, few could have imagined that this very flight would soon become etched in the annals of aviation history for tragic reasons. Because at that moment, it was nothing more than another international connection, bridging continents, cultures, and lives, and within the cabin, passengers settled into their seats with the usual mixture of anticipation and routine, some browsing magazines or chatting quietly, some already drifting into sleep as the engines roared steadily beneath them, while the crew went about their duties with professionalism, maintaining the balance of service and safety that defines every flight. And outside, the night sky stretched wide over the Pacific before giving way to the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, with the plane gliding confidently across international airways, and the aircraft itself, a Boeing 747 named Helderberg, stood as a symbol of South African Airways' reach and prestige during a time when long-distance air travel was still a marvel for many. Its sheer size, its ability to carry both people and freight, and its advanced design, inspiring confidence in all those who entrusted their lives to it. And yet hidden beneath the normalcy of takeoff and the serenity of cruising altitude was an undercurrent of fate that no one could predict. Because while the engines hummed and the lights dimmed and flight attendants served meals and reassured children, the clock was quietly ticking toward one of the darkest nights in aviation history. And at that point, the journey represented nothing more than connection, carrying not only people but also hopes, dreams, and cargo across thousands of miles, bridging the East with the South, and offering passengers the promise of arriving to loved ones, business meetings, or new opportunities. And in that calm beginning, where safety checks were completed, where the captain and first officer conversed professionally in the cockpit, where the aircraft climbed smoothly into the skies above Asia, no one could foresee that this seemingly ordinary flight would soon transform from a chapter of routine travel into a story of loss, unanswered questions, and haunting mystery that the world would remember for decades to come. Several hours after South African Airways Flight 295, the Helderberg, had departed Taipei and crossed into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean, the calm rhythm of a routine long-haul journey began to unravel as signs of trouble slowly emerged from within the aircraft. Because somewhere in the main deck cargo area, hidden from the passengers who sat only a few feet above, a fire had begun to take hold. And though modern aircraft are built with layers of protection and monitoring systems, in this case the danger developed with terrifying speed as smoke detectors triggered alarms, and the flight crew realized that they were facing a situation far beyond the ordinary scope of in-flight problems. And while the passengers remained mostly unaware at first, the cabin crew began to detect the acrid smell of smoke creeping through vents and corridors, the kind of smell that instantly transforms the atmosphere from routine to urgent. And in the cockpit, the captain and first officer responded with trained precision, reviewing emergency checklists, communicating with air traffic control, and beginning the complex process of planning a diversion. Yet despite their professionalism, the invisible enemy continued to grow in strength, because fire inside an aircraft is among the most lethal dangers imaginable, capable of overwhelming systems, filling compartments with smoke, and destroying critical wiring. And as the minutes passed, the crew's voices grew tighter and more urgent over the radio, while their instruments began to display erratic readings, a sure sign that vital components were being damaged by the advancing flames. And in the passenger cabin, unease began to spread as the smoke thickened, some travelers coughing, others asking questions, children beginning to cry, while the attendants tried to balance calm reassurance with the knowledge that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. And in those moments, routine gave way entirely to disaster, because what had begun as an ordinary night flight across the ocean was now a desperate battle for survival at 35,000 feet. And with each breath, the people on board were confronted not only with smoke but with fear, the unsettling realization that they were far from land, surrounded by darkness above the sea, reliant solely on the skill of the pilots and the resilience of the aircraft. Yet the fire did not relent, instead spreading with devastating speed and making it clear that this was no temporary disturbance but an escalating catastrophe. And thus the stage was set for the heartbreaking final chapter of the Helderberg, as a routine journey slipped irreversibly into one of the most tragic accidents in aviation history. Inside the cockpit of South African Airways Flight 295, The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, yet the crew responded with remarkable discipline and professionalism as the fire warning alarms echoed and smoke indicators lit up across the panels, forcing Captain Dawood Uys and his fellow pilots to rely on every ounce of training and experience they possessed while communicating urgently with air traffic controllers and declaring their intent to divert toward Mauritius, the nearest safe landing option. And even as the heat and smoke began to compromise vital systems, the captain maintained composure, coordinating with the flight engineer and co-pilot to follow emergency procedures in an attempt to isolate the source of the fire and prevent it from spreading further throughout the aircraft. While at the same time, the cabin crew faced an equally daunting challenge, moving quickly through the aisles despite choking fumes. To keep passengers calm, distribute wet cloths to ease breathing, and reassure frightened travelers that the situation was under control, even though, in their own minds, they knew how perilous it had become. And during these terrifying minutes, the teamwork between cockpit and cabin embodied the very essence of aviation professionalism, with every crew member focused solely on buying more time and keeping the aircraft airborne long enough to reach land and safety. And although conditions worsened rapidly, with smoke beginning to penetrate deeper into the cabin and instruments failing one after another, the pilots refused to abandon their effort, continuing to broadcast updates and struggle with controls that were becoming increasingly unreliable. And the courage they displayed in those moments was not born of hope for themselves, but of responsibility to the 141 passengers behind them, because they knew their only chance of survival was to fight relentlessly against the odds. And as flames spread through the cargo hold, damaging wires and feeding on oxygen within the sealed fuselage, the crew still tried every available measure, from adjusting pressurization to rerouting systems, all in the hope of suppressing the blaze and maintaining control. And the cabin crew to pressed forward through the smoke, assisting children, holding hands of the elderly, and never allowing panic to spiral into chaos. And though history records that their efforts could not ultimately prevent disaster, what must never be forgotten is the sheer resilience they demonstrated in those final minutes, a human determination stronger than fear itself. And it is this heroic response by the crew of Flight 295 that stands as a lasting testament to the professionalism of aviation teams everywhere, who in the face of the unimaginable still choose to fight for every life under their care. As the fire inside South African Airways Flight 295 continued to rage, the aircraft began to suffer catastrophic failures that stripped the crew of their ability to properly control and monitor the situation, because fire in an airplane does not merely produce smoke, it devours wires, melts insulation, and cripples the very systems that keep the machine in the air. And soon the pilots were confronted with failing instruments, flickering displays, and warning lights that no longer told the full truth, leaving them to rely on skill, instinct, and fragments of information in order to guide the massive Boeing 747 through the darkness of the night sky over the Indian Ocean, while communication with air traffic controllers became strained and difficult as radios faltered under the damage. And inside the cabin, passengers were breathing heavy smoke that was now thick enough to cloud vision and sting eyes, leaving many coughing and terrified, while flight attendants fought to move among them with diminishing effectiveness, because the conditions grew unbearable. And in the cockpit, the crew faced the terrifying reality that their oxygen masks and emergency equipment were no longer enough to counter the fire as relentless spread, and the once powerful engines that had lifted the Helderberg from Taipei began to respond unevenly as control cables and electrical circuits degraded, and every passing second robbed the crew of yet another vital system that might have aided their survival. And as the Boeing struggled forward toward Mauritius, it became increasingly clear that the fire was dismantling the aircraft from within, as autopilot functions collapsed, gauges froze or failed, and hydraulic lines, essential for steering the massive jet, were weakened by heat and smoke. So the pilots had to wrestle with controls that no longer responded with precision, while simultaneously choking on fumes that blurred judgment and strained endurance. And throughout this ordeal, the plane itself seemed to be breaking down piece by piece, the lights flickering in the cabin, the ventilation spreading more smoke than fresh air, the alarms bloat screaming endlessly until they too began to die out. And for the passengers, the sense of fear turned to dread as the darkness of the cabin mixed with the suffocating atmosphere, and every sound of groaning metal and sputtering machinery reinforced the realization that the systems meant to protect them were vanishing one after another. And for the crew, the collapse of these systems marked the point where skill alone could no longer compensate, because no matter how determined or trained, they were without functioning instruments and controls. The battle became one of time and endurance against a machine that was being consumed from within, and this rapid cascade of system failures transformed a controlled emergency into an unstoppable catastrophe, pushing the Helderberg closer to its tragic fate. In the final minutes of South African Airways Flight 295, the situation that had begun as a hidden fire and escalated into failing systems reached its ultimate and irreversible stage as the Boeing 747 Helderberg struggled desperately toward it. Mauritius, but the combined effects of smoke, flames, and structural damage were now too severe for even the most skilled pilots to overcome, and while Captain Dawad Uis and his crew clung to their duty, broadcasting final calls and steering the crippled aircraft through the night sky, the reality was that the fire had already undermined the integrity of the jet itself because its control systems were failing, its cabin was saturated with toxic smoke, and its structure was weakening under the relentless assault of heat. And in those moments, the passengers faced the terrifying awareness that survival was slipping away, with children crying, parents holding them tightly, people praying, and some clinging to hope that the pilots might still somehow land the plane. Yet, the environment inside grew unendurable as the smoke thickened to black clouds and oxygen supplies diminished while attendants continued working until they could no longer move freely through the aisles. And in the cockpit, the pilots struggled against controls that no longer obeyed their commands, instruments that provided only fragments of information, and engines that faltered under strain. And though they had declared their emergency and were nearing Mauritius, every second of flight carried them closer not to safety, but to collapse, because the damage inside the cargo hold had spread beyond containment and the fire continued to consume the aircraft from within, until finally the forces at play became too much and the Helderberg began to break apart over the Indian Ocean. And in that dreadful moment, the passengers and crew, who had fought for survival through smoke and fear, were overwhelmed as the massive jet disintegrated in midair, scattering wreckage across the dark waters and extinguishing the lives of all 159 souls aboard. And the radio fell silent, the lights of the cockpit were gone, and only the echo of the crew's final struggle remained to tell the story. And this end, though tragic, also reflected the resilience and courage of those on board, because until the very last second, the pilots tried to guide their failing aircraft and the attendants tried to calm their passengers, and the passengers themselves held on to hope against the darkness. But the destruction was final and swift, leaving behind one of aviation's most haunting disasters. In the aftermath of the crash of South African Airways Flight 295, the lingering mystery surrounding the tragedy became as significant as the disaster itself, because while investigators were able to determine that the fire began in the main deck cargo compartment, the actual cause of that fire has never been fully resolved, and this uncertainty has fueled decades of speculation, conspiracy theories, and unanswered questions that continue to surround the Helderberg to this day, as salvage teams recovered fragments of wreckage from the depths of the Indian Ocean and brought back the flight recorders. What emerged was an incomplete and unsettling picture, showing that the crew had battled courageously against overwhelming odds, yet providing little clarity on what ignited the blaze that brought the giant aircraft down. And official reports suggested possible hazardous cargo as the source, while others pointed toward undeclared or even deliberately concealed materials that may have been loaded into the aircraft, and whispers of political intrigue and secret shipments tied to South Africa's apartheid-era government only deepened the controversy, because if dangerous goods had been carried on board without proper declaration, then the tragedy was not merely an accident but a consequence of negligence or deliberate concealment. And for the families of the 159 souls lost, the lack of a definitive answer only intensified their grief, as they were left to wonder whether their loved ones were victims of a hidden chain of events that went beyond bad luck or unfortunate circumstance. And through the years, experts, journalists, and aviation analysts have revisited the Helderberg case, poring over the limited evidence and the transcripts of the crew's final communications. Yet even with modern technology, the truth remains elusive, because too much of the wreckage was destroyed or unrecovered, and the ocean itself guarded its secrets with silence. And so the legacy of Flight 295 endures, not only as a story of fire and loss, but also as a haunting reminder of how questions can remain even after decades of inquiry, and how uncertainty can weigh just as heavily as the disaster itself. And for aviation safety, it became a lesson that transparency, cargo regulations, and fire detection systems must always evolve to prevent recurrence. But for the families and the public, the lingering mystery ensures that the Helderberg is remembered, not only as a tragedy of the skies, but as an unresolved puzzle that continues to echo across history.